Let me start with a number that should shock you. Over 480,000 Americans die every year from smoking-related diseases. That's more than car accidents, alcohol, AIDS, illegal drugs, and murders combined. And here's the thing, a huge chunk of those deaths? They're connected to brands like Camel Cigarettes. You've probably seen the logo. That camel standing in front of a pyramid. Simple, memorable, iconic. For decades, Camel wasn't just a cigarette brand, it was a cultural phenomenon. Soldiers smoked them in trenches during World War I. Movie stars puffed them on screen. By the 1940s, Camel owned nearly half the cigarette market in America. Half? They were everywhere. But here's what they didn't tell you in those slick ads with doctors and celebrities. Camel cigarettes were killing people. And the company behind them? Reynolds Tobacco Company? They knew it. They knew smoking caused cancer. They knew nicotine was addictive, and they lied about it for decades. They spent billions on advertising designed to make smoking look cool, safe, even healthy. They targeted soldiers. They targeted women. And worst of all, they targeted children. If this kind of hidden business truth interests you, smash that like button right now and subscribe to Business Behind Fame for more stories like this. The story of Camel Cigarettes is one of brilliant marketing mixed with deadly deception. It's about a company that built an empire worth billions of dollars on the backs of addicted customers. Customers who got hooked young and died young. How it's about internal documents that prove they knew the truth while they sold lies to the public. And it's about a cartoon character, Joe Camel, that became so famous among kids that it sparked a national scandal. This is the dark truth behind Camel Cigarettes. A story about addiction, lies, and billions in profit. And it all started in 1913. R.J. Reynolds was a North Carolina tobacco man. Born in 1850, he started his tobacco company in Winston-Salem in 1875. Back then, most people chewed tobacco or smoked pipes and cigars. Cigarettes were considered kind of fancy, expensive, mostly hand-rolled, and not that popular yet. But Reynolds saw potential. He wanted to create a cigarette that would change everything. In 1913, Reynolds launched Camel Cigarettes. The product was revolutionary for one key reason: the blend. Instead of using just one type of tobacco like most cigarettes at the time, Camel mixed different tobaccos together. They combined bright Virginia tobacco with Turkish tobacco and burley tobacco. This created a unique, smoother taste that people really liked. It also created a product that delivered nicotine more efficiently, more addictive, more profitable. The packaging was genius, too. That Camel logo became instantly recognizable. The story goes that Reynolds saw a dromedary camel named Old Joe in a circus passing through town and used it as inspiration. True or not, the branding worked. But the real innovation was this. Camel became the first nationally distributed packaged cigarette brand in America. Before this, cigarettes were often sold loose or in regional markets. Camel went everywhere, coast to coast, and they were cheap, 10 cents for a pack of 20 cigarettes. In 1913 money, that was affordable for working people. Reynolds flooded the market. He spent huge money on advertising, something like $1.5 million in the first year alone, which was insane for that time. One famous ad campaign just said, "The camels are coming," over and over. It built mystery. People got curious. Then when the cigarettes hit stores, they flew off the shelves. Within 3 years, Camel was the best-selling cigarette in America. By 1923, they controlled over 40% of the entire cigarette market. 40%. That's domination. Sales went from about 425 million cigarettes in 1913 to over 18 billion by 1923, according to company records and FTC data. 18 billion cigarettes in a single year from one brand. The profits were astronomical. But here's where the dark side starts to creep in. Even back then, some people suspected smoking might be harmful, but there was no proof, no studies, no regulation. Reynolds and other tobacco companies were free to sell as much as they wanted, to whoever they wanted. And they did. They marketed Camel as mild, smooth, and enjoyable. Not as dangerous, not as addictive, just as a pleasure. And then came the wars. World War I changed everything for Camel cigarettes. When America entered the war in 1917, millions of young men shipped off to Europe. And guess what the military included in soldiers' rations? Cigarettes. Lots of them. The government bought massive quantities of Camels and other brands to send to the troops. General John Pershing, commander of American forces, even sent a message saying tobacco was as important as food for morale. Soldiers smoked in trenches. They smoked in camps. They smoked everywhere. This did two things for Camel. First, it created millions of new addicted customers. Young men who'd never smoked before got hooked in the military and came home craving cigarettes. Second, it gave smoking a patriotic image. Smoking was what soldiers did. It was manly. It was American. Camel rode that wave hard. Ads showed soldiers smoking Camels, looking tough and heroic. By the 1920s, Camel was unstoppable. The Roaring Twenties brought economic boom, and people had money to spend. Cigarette smoking exploded. And in 1920, Americans smoked about 44 billion cigarettes total. By 1930, over 119 billion. Camel was leading the pack, selling roughly 40 to 45 billion cigarettes a year at its peak in the late 1920s and early 1930s, based on market share data and industry reports. R.J. Reynolds knew how to advertise. They didn't just sell cigarettes, they sold a lifestyle. One of their most famous slogans, launched in 1921, "I'd walk a mile for a Camel." It suggested Camel cigarettes were so good, so satisfying, that people would go out of their way to get them. The slogan stuck for decades. It became part of American culture. But Reynolds didn't stop there. They started targeting new markets. Up until the 1920s, smoking was mostly a male thing. Women who smoked were seen as scandalous or improper. But Reynolds and other tobacco companies saw an opportunity. Half the population wasn't smoking yet. So they crafted ads to make smoking seem feminine, sophisticated, and liberating for women. By the 1930s, women's smoking rates started climbing. More customers, more addiction, more profit. Then came World War II. And just like in World War I, cigarettes became part of military life. Camel was one of the top brands sent to American troops fighting in Europe and the Pacific. Soldiers got free or cheap cigarettes in their rations. Again, millions of young men got hooked. The government basically subsidized the tobacco industry by distributing cigarettes to the military. Camel's sales soared even higher. During the 1940s, Camel's market share hovered between 25 and 30% of all cigarettes sold in the U.S. According to Federal Trade Commission tobacco reports, they were selling tens of billions of cigarettes every single year. The company made money hand over fist. R.J. Reynolds became one of the richest corporations in America. The advertising got slicker. Camel ran ads in magazines, on radio, and eventually on the new medium of television. They sponsored shows. They hired celebrities. Movie stars like Humphrey Bogart and John Wayne were associated with smoking. Even if they weren't in Camel ads specifically, the image of tough guys smoking filtered into Camel's brand. Smoking was cool. Smoking was normal. Everybody did it. One stat really shows how big cigarettes got. In 1950, about 44% of all American adults smoked. Nearly half. And Camel was one of the top 3 brands alongside Lucky Strike and Chesterfield. Together, these 3 brands controlled around 80% of the market in the late 1940s. It was an oligopoly. A few companies making billions by selling an addictive product to nearly half the country. But here's the thing. Nobody was talking about publicly yet. People were getting sick. Lung cancer rates were rising. Doctors were starting to notice patterns. Smokers seemed to get lung cancer way more than non-smokers. Some scientists began studying the link. In the 1930s and 1940s, a few research papers suggested cigarettes might cause cancer. But these studies were small, not widely publicized, and the tobacco companies fought back hard. R.J. Reynolds and the other big tobacco companies had a strategy: deny, deflect, and delay. but deny that smoking caused harm, deflect blame onto other factors like pollution or genetics, and delay any regulation or public acceptance of the science. It worked for a long time. Too long. By the early 1950s, though, the evidence was piling up. Multiple studies in the U.S. and Britain showed strong statistical links between smoking and lung cancer. In 1952 and 1953, major medical journals published research confirming the connection. Reader's Digest ran an article titled "Cancer by the Carton" in 1952 that scared millions of readers. Suddenly, the public started worrying. Cigarette sales actually dipped slightly in 1953 and 1954. People were nervous, and this is where Camel and the other tobacco companies made a choice. A dark, calculated choice. They could have admitted the risks. They could have warned their customers. They could have changed their business model, but they didn't. Instead, they launched one of the biggest corporate disinformation campaigns in history. Hiding the Truth About Health, 1950s to 1970s. On January 4, 1954, the major tobacco companies, including R.J. Reynolds, published a full-page ad in over 400 newspapers across America. It was called "A Frank Statement to Cigarette Smokers." This ad reached tens of millions of people, and it was a masterpiece of deception. The frank statement said, basically, that the tobacco companies cared about public health. It said they accepted the responsibility to learn the facts about smoking and health. It acknowledged that people were worried. But then, and here's the key part, it cast doubt on the science. It said the studies linking smoking to cancer were not conclusive. It said many scientists questioned the findings. It promised the industry would fund independent research to get to the truth. It sounded reasonable. But it was a lie. The whole point of the frank statement was to buy time and confuse the public. The tobacco companies weren't actually looking for the truth. They already knew the truth. Internal documents that came out decades later in lawsuits proved that tobacco companies had their own scientists studying smoking and health. And those scientists found the same thing the outside researchers found. Smoking caused cancer and was highly addictive. But publicly, R.J. Reynolds and the others kept denying it. They created an organization called the Tobacco Industry Research Committee. I later renamed the Council for Tobacco Research, which sounds official and scientific. And they did fund some research. But the real purpose was to create controversy and doubt. If they could make it seem like the science was uncertain, people would keep smoking. And it worked. Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, Camel kept selling. They adapted their marketing to address health fears without admitting guilt. One tactic was filters. In the mid-1950s, cigarette companies started heavily promoting filtered cigarettes as safer. Camel introduced new filtered varieties. The idea was that filters would trap some of the harmful stuff before it reached your lungs. But here's the dirty secret, revealed later in internal company documents. Filters didn't make cigarettes much safer. In many cases, smokers just puffed harder or smoked more to get the same nicotine hit, so they ended up inhaling just as much tar and toxins. Some filters even had asbestos in them in early versions, which is absolutely insane and incredibly dangerous. The industry knew filters were mostly a marketing gimmick to make people feel better, not to actually protect them. Camel also ran ads that were shockingly dishonest by today's standards. One of the most infamous campaigns was "More doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette." Yes, you read that right. Camel ran ads in the 1940s and early 1950s claiming that doctors preferred Camels. They'd show images of doctors in white coats, looking trustworthy, holding a Camel cigarette. The message was clear: if doctors smoke them, they must be safe. This was based on questionable surveys where tobacco companies literally handed out free Camels to doctors at medical conventions and then asked what brand they smoked. Surprise! Lots said Camel because they'd just gotten free ones. It was manipulation, and it worked. People trusted doctors. If doctors smoked Camels, how bad could they be? But behind the scenes, R.J. Reynolds scientists knew smoking was deadly. documents from the UCSF Truth Tobacco industry. Documents Library, a massive archive of internal tobacco company papers released through lawsuits, show that Reynolds had research in the 1950s and 1960s confirming nicotine was addictive and that smoking caused cancer and heart disease. One internal memo from the 1960s even called cigarettes a nicotine delivery device. They knew. They absolutely knew. So yet publicly, company executives went in front of Congress and said there was no proof smoking caused harm. In 1964, the U.S. Surgeon General released a landmark report, Smoking and Health. It was based on over 7,000 scientific studies. The conclusion was clear and definitive. Cigarette smoking caused lung cancer, chronic bronchitis, and probably heart disease. It was a massive deal. The report made front-page news everywhere. How did the tobacco companies respond? They attacked it. They said the Surgeon General was overreaching. They said the science was still debatable. R.J. Reynolds and the others doubled down on denial. They funded more of their own research designed to poke holes in the real science. They hired scientists and consultants to publicly question the findings. And they spent millions on PR campaigns to keep people confused, and it worked for a while. The cigarette sales did drop a little after the 1964 report, but within a few years they bounced back. People were addicted. Nicotine addiction is powerful. Even people who wanted to quit often couldn't, and Camel kept selling billions of cigarettes every year through the 1960s and 1970s. In 1965, Congress passed a law requiring warning labels on cigarette packs. Starting in 1966, every pack had to say, "Caution, cigarette smoking may be hazardous to your health." Notice the word may, not is. May? The tobacco lobby fought hard to water down the language. Later, in 1969, the warning got a bit stronger, saying smoking is dangerous. But even then, it was pretty mild. In 1971, cigarette advertising was banned from TV and radio in the U.S. This was a big deal. For decades, tobacco companies had poured money into broadcast ads. Now they had to rely on print, billboards, and sponsorships. But they adapted. They started sponsoring sports events, concerts, and car races. They plastered cigarette ads in magazines and on giant billboards. Camel's branding was still everywhere. Through the 1970s, more evidence piled up. Studies showed smoking caused emphysema, heart attacks, strokes, and other cancers beyond just lung cancer. Secondhand smoke was found to be dangerous too, meaning smokers were harming people around them. The Surgeon General released more reports. The health community was united. Smoking killed. But R.J. Reynolds kept denying and deflecting. Internal documents show they studied safer cigarette designs but never brought them to market because it might imply their current products were unsafe. They researched nicotine levels carefully to keep people hooked. Not too much that people got sick too fast, but enough to maintain addiction. It was calculated, it was cold, and it kept the money flowing. This stuff is crazy, right? If you're shocked by how companies hid the truth, drop a comment below with your thoughts, like this video, and subscribe to Business Behind Fame. We expose more of these stories every week. By the 1980s, Camel's market share was slipping. They'd dominated for decades, but now competition was fierce. Marlboro had taken over as the #1 brand with its iconic cowboy ads. Other brands were gaining ground. Health awareness was rising. More people were trying to quit. Camel was still a big brand, but they were losing their edge. They needed something new, something bold, something to bring in fresh, young customers. And that's when they made one of the most controversial marketing decisions in history. They created Joe Camel. The Joe Camel disaster. Targeting kids, 1980s to 1990s. In 1988, R.J. Reynolds launched a new advertising campaign for Camel Cigarettes featuring a cartoon character, Joe Camel. Also called Old Joe or Smooth Character, Joe Camel was a cool anthropomorphic camel. He wore sunglasses, leather jackets, and hung out at pool halls and parties. He played saxophone. He rode motorcycles. He was surrounded by beautiful women. He was the epitome of cool, and kids absolutely loved him. Let me set the stage. And by the late 1980s, Camel's market share among young adult smokers was dismal. According to internal R.J. Reynolds documents and later court filings, Camel had less than 3% of the cigarette market among smokers aged 18 to 24. The brand was seen as old-fashioned, something your grandpa smoked. Reynolds needed to turn that around. Young smokers were crucial because if you hooked someone in their teens or early 20s, you had a customer for life, an addicted customer who'd buy your product for decades. So they created Joe Camel. The campaign was supposedly aimed at young adults, people in their 20s. But here's the problem, and this is the dark heart of the scandal. The ads appealed massively to children and teenagers. Joe Camel was a cartoon. Cartoons are for kids. The character was playful, adventurous, and fun. Kids saw Joe Camel in magazines, on billboards, on promotional items like T-shirts and hats, and they loved him. A study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA, in 1991 dropped a bombshell. Researchers showed images of various brand logos to kids aged 3 to 6 years old. They found that nearly as many kids recognized Joe Camel as recognized Mickey Mouse. About 30% of 3-year-olds and over 90% of 6-year-olds knew Joe Camel. By age 6, kids associated Joe Camel with cigarettes. Think about that. 6-year-olds knew this cigarette mascot as well as they knew one of the most famous cartoon characters ever created. The study concluded that Joe Camel was far more effective at marketing to children than to adults. Kids were being branded, imprinted, and the data showed it was working. Before Joe Camel launched in 1988, Camel's share of the under-18 illegal cigarette market, meaning cigarettes smoked by minors, was less than 1%. By 1991, just 3 years later, it had jumped to over 32% among underage smokers, according to research cited in multiple lawsuits and public health studies. Let me repeat that. In 3 years, Camel went from basically nothing among kids to nearly 1/3 of the illegal youth market. That's millions of underage kids smoking Camels. Kids who weren't legally allowed to buy cigarettes, but were doing it anyway. And they were choosing Camel because of a cartoon camel. R.J. Reynolds denied they were targeting kids. They said Joe Camel was designed for adults in their 20s. And they said it was just good marketing and that any appeal to minors was unintentional. But internal documents told a different story. Papers that came out in lawsuits in the 1990s showed that Reynolds absolutely knew young people, including teenagers, were a key target. One infamous internal document talked about the need to attract replacement smokers. See, older smokers were dying off. Literally, hundreds of thousands of people died from smoking-related diseases every year, and most of them were long-time smokers. To keep profits up, tobacco companies needed new smokers to replace the dead ones. And the best time to hook a new smoker? When they're young, teenagers, and young adults. Get them addicted early, and they're customers for life. Another document, a research presentation from Reynolds in the 1970s, talked about studying smoking behavior among people as young as 14. 14. They were literally researching children. The presentation discussed how younger teens were attracted to certain brand images and flavors. This wasn't about accidentally appealing to kids. This was strategic. Joe Camel fit perfectly into this strategy. The character made smoking look fun, rebellious, and cool, exactly what appeals to teenagers trying to look mature and independent. The ads didn't show health warnings prominently. They didn't show the reality of addiction or disease. They showed parties, adventure, and sex appeal. Promotional items made it worse. R.J. Reynolds gave away Joe Camel merchandise, hats, T-shirts, jackets, at events and through mail-in offers. Kids collected this stuff. They wore Joe Camel gear. It was free advertising, and it normalized the brand among young people. Some of these items even required Camel Cash, which you got by buying packs of Camels. So kids were either getting adults to buy cigarettes for them or buying them illegally to collect points for cool swag. It was insidious. Public health groups and politicians started noticing. In 1991, the same year as that JAMA study, Surgeon General Antonia Novello publicly called for R.J. Reynolds to end the Joe Camel campaign. She said it was clearly appealing to children and that it violated ethical standards. The American Medical Association backed her up. So did groups like the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids and the American Lung Association. But Reynolds didn't budge. They kept running Joe Camel ads for 6 more years. The profits were too good. By the mid-1990s, Camel's overall market share among all smokers was still relatively small, around 4 to 5% of the total market. But among young smokers, particularly teens and early 20s, it was much higher. Some studies showed Camel was the second or third most popular brand among high school smokers by the mid-90s. Reynolds was making hundreds of millions of dollars a year from Camel sales, and a significant chunk of that came from young smokers who'd gotten hooked thanks to Joe Camel. Then came the lawsuits. In 1997, a landmark case emerged. A woman named Janet Mangini, a California lawyer and anti-smoking advocate, filed a class-action lawsuit against R.J. Reynolds on behalf of kids in California. The lawsuit alleged that the Joe Camel campaign illegally targeted minors and violated California's consumer protection and unfair business practice laws. The case was huge. It dragged internal Reynolds documents into the public eye. Memos, marketing plans, research studies, stuff the company never wanted anyone to see. The evidence was damning. It showed that Reynolds knew Joe Camel appealed to kids. It showed they tracked underage smoking rates. It showed they celebrated the campaign's success in reaching young people. Around the same time, the Federal Trade Commission, FTC, started investigating whether Joe Camel violated federal laws against unfair advertising. In 1997, the FTC formally charged R.J. Reynolds, saying the campaign was unfair because it targeted people under 18 and contributed to underage smoking. And this was a big deal. The FTC doesn't bring charges lightly. Then came even more pressure. State attorneys general from across the country were suing tobacco companies for the massive healthcare costs of treating smoking-related diseases. These lawsuits were combining into what became the Master Settlement Agreement, MSA, a massive legal settlement between 46 states and the 4 biggest tobacco companies, including R.J. Reynolds. Part of the negotiations for the MSA included demands to stop marketing to kids. Cartoon characters like Joe Camel were Exhibit A in proving the industry targeted minors. The states wanted them gone. Public opinion was turning hard against big tobacco. The media was covering the internal documents, the lawsuits, the evidence of targeting kids. Reynolds was facing a PR disaster. Finally, in July 1997, R.J. Reynolds announced they were retiring Joe Camel. After 9 years, the smooth character was done. The company claimed it was a voluntary decision and that they still denied targeting kids. But let's be real. They killed Joe Camel because they had no choice. The lawsuits, the FTC charges, and the public outcry made it impossible to continue. But the damage was done. An entire generation of kids had grown up seeing Joe Camel. Millions of them had started smoking during the campaign. Studies estimated that the Joe Camel campaign led to increased smoking initiation among minors, resulting in hundreds of thousands of additional young smokers. Many of those kids became addicted and kept smoking into adulthood. Some of them are still smoking today. Some of them are dead from smoking-related diseases. The Master Settlement Agreement was finalized in November 1998. It required the tobacco companies to pay states over $200 billion over 25 years to cover health care costs. It also imposed strict marketing restrictions: no billboards, no cartoon characters, no sponsorships of youth-oriented events, no free samples where kids could get them, and no targeting of minors in any way. It was the biggest corporate settlement in history. But here's the thing, it wasn't enough. The MSA didn't shut down the tobacco companies. It didn't make them admit they lied for decades. R.J. Reynolds and the others just paid the fines and kept selling cigarettes. They adjusted their marketing but kept making billions. And the money from the settlement? A lot of states didn't even use it for smoking prevention or health care. If they used it to plug budget holes, it was a flawed deal. For Camel specifically, Joe Camel's retirement marked the beginning of a long decline. The brand had gained short-term success among young smokers, but it also became a symbol of corporate greed and deception. Parents, teachers, and health advocates pointed to Joe Camel as proof that big tobacco had no morals. The brand's reputation was tarnished, and the data backed it up. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, youth smoking rates peaked in the mid-1990s during the Joe Camel era. In 1997, about 36% of high school students smoked. After the MSA and increased public health efforts, those rates started dropping. By the early 2000s, youth smoking rates were falling. It took years, but eventually the restrictions and public awareness campaigns started working. But the Joe Camel disaster was a perfect example of how far a corporation will go to protect profits. R.J. Reynolds knew they were reaching kids. The evidence proves it. But they did it anyway because it made money. They addicted children to a product that would kill many of them later in life. And they lied about it the whole time. If that doesn't show the dark side of business, I don't know what does. The slow fall and lasting damage, 2000s to today. After the 1998 Master Settlement Agreement, Camel Cigarettes entered a slow, steady decline. The glory days were over. The brand that once controlled 40% of the market was now a shadow of its former self. By the early 2000s, Camel's market share had dropped to around 7 to 8% of total U.S. cigarette sales, according to Federal Trade Commission reports and industry analysis. They were still selling billions of cigarettes a year. Don't get me wrong, they were still making money, but they were nowhere near the dominance of the mid-20th century. Marlboro, owned by Philip Morris, later Altria, had taken over and held nearly half the market. Camel was a distant player. Several factors drove Camel's decline. First, the marketing restrictions from the MSA. No more cartoon characters, no more billboards near schools, no more free merchandise targeting young people. R.J. Reynolds had to completely change how they advertised. They shifted to adult-focused marketing, but it was way less effective. The edgy, rebellious image Joe Camel had built was gone. What replaced it was generic, boring cigarette ads that looked like every other brand. Second, public awareness about smoking dangers had reached a tipping point. By the 2000s, the link between smoking and cancer, heart disease, and death was undeniable and widely known. Smoking rates among adults kept dropping. In 2000, about 23% of American adults smoked. By 2020, that number had fallen to around 12.5%, according to CDC data. Fewer smokers meant fewer customers for Camel. Third, regulation kept tightening. In 2009, the federal government gave the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, authority to regulate tobacco products. This was huge. The FDA started imposing rules on tobacco companies, requiring more prominent warning labels, restricting flavors in cigarettes, and monitoring marketing practices. Camel had to comply or face massive fines. One example, in 2015, the FDA ordered R.J. Reynolds to stop using certain marketing terms that implied some cigarettes were safer than others, things like light or low tar. Companies had used these terms for decades to make cigarettes seem less harmful, but studies showed they weren't actually safer. Smokers just compensated by inhaling deeper or smoking more. The FDA cracked down, and Camel had to change its labeling. Fourth, competition from alternative nicotine products exploded in the 2000s. E-cigarettes and vaping devices like Juul became wildly popular, especially among younger people. These products were marketed as less harmful than traditional cigarettes. Whether that's true is still being studied and debated, but they definitely stole market share from cigarette brands like Camel. By 2018, millions of people, especially teens and young adults, were vaping instead of smoking. Camel tried to get into the vape market with their own products, but they were playing catch-up. Fifth, cultural attitudes shifted. Smoking went from being seen as cool and normal to being stigmatized. Fewer movies and TV shows showed characters smoking. Public smoking bans spread across the country. You couldn't smoke in restaurants, bars, offices, or most public spaces anymore. Smokers were pushed outside, made to feel like pariahs. This social pressure helped drive down smoking rates and hurt brands like Camel. But even in decline, R.J. Reynolds kept making money. Here's the thing about the tobacco business. It's incredibly profitable even with shrinking customer bases. A pack of Camels costs maybe $1 or $2 to produce, but sells for $8 to $10 or more. The profit margins are massive, and nicotine addiction means customers keep buying even as they know the product is killing them. So even though Camel's market share dropped, the company was still raking in billions. In 2015, R.J. Reynolds merged with British American Tobacco, BAT, in a deal worth billions of dollars. BAT is one of the largest tobacco companies in the world. The merger was about consolidating power and surviving in a shrinking market. Together, they had global reach and could weather the decline of smoking in developed countries by pushing cigarettes in developing nations where regulation was weaker. It was a smart business move. A dark business move, but smart. Today, in 2026, Camel is still around. You can still buy Camel cigarettes in stores across America and in many countries worldwide, but the brand is a ghost of what it once was. According to recent FTC and CDC data, Camel's U.S. market share hovers around 6 to 7%. They've introduced various sub-brands and variations: Camel Crush, Camel Blue, Camel Wides, trying to appeal to different niches of smokers. But they're not a cultural icon anymore. They're just another cigarette brand slowly fading away. The lasting damage from Camel and the broader tobacco industry is staggering. Let's talk numbers. According to the CDC, smoking kills over 480,000 Americans every year. That's about 1,300 people per day. Since the Surgeon General's first report in 1964, over 20 million Americans have died from smoking-related causes. 20 million? That includes smokers and people who died from secondhand smoke exposure. Globally, the World Health Organization estimates that tobacco kills more than 8 million people every year worldwide. Of those, about 1.2 million are non-smokers exposed to secondhand smoke. 8 million deaths a year from a legal product. It's the single largest preventable cause of death on the planet. Camel's role in this? It's impossible to calculate exactly, but we know Camel was one of the top-selling cigarette brands for decades. Billions of people smoked Camels over the last century. A significant percentage of those people got sick and died because of it. Lung cancer, emphysema, heart attacks, strokes. Camel cigarettes contributed to countless deaths. And let's not forget the economic cost. Smoking-related healthcare expenses in the U.S. alone are estimated at over $170 billion per year. That's treating lung cancer, heart disease, COPD, and all the other illnesses caused by smoking. Plus another $156 billion in lost productivity because smokers die younger or can't work due to illness. That's over $300 billion a year in costs to society. Camel and other tobacco brands profited while society paid the price. The lies R.J. Reynolds told over the decades are part of the reason the damage was so bad. If they'd admitted the truth in the 1950s when the science became clear, millions of lives could have been saved. People could have made informed choices. Instead, the company spent decades denying, deceiving, and delaying. They fought every regulation. They attacked every scientist who spoke the truth. They protected their profits at the expense of human lives. And here's the kicker, they're still doing it in other parts of the world. While smoking rates have dropped in the U.S. and Europe thanks to regulation and awareness, tobacco companies like R.J. Reynolds, now part of British American Tobacco, are aggressively marketing in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Countries with weaker regulations, less public health infrastructure, and millions of potential new customers. They're using the same playbook: target young people, or create aspirational branding, downplay health risks in places where they can still get away with it. It's the same dark business model, just relocated. Conclusion. So, let's wrap this up. The story of Camel Cigarettes is a story of incredible business success built on addiction, lies, and human suffering. R.J. Reynolds created a product that dominated the American market for decades. They made billions of dollars. They built a brand that became a cultural icon. But they did it by selling a product they knew was deadly. They hid the truth about cancer and addiction. They targeted soldiers, women, and worst of all, children. They used cartoon characters to hook kids on nicotine. They fought regulation at every turn, and when they finally got caught, they paid fines but never really faced justice. Nobody went to jail. The company kept operating. The profits kept flowing. The human cost is staggering. Millions of people addicted. Millions dead. Families destroyed. Lives cut short. And for what? So a corporation could make money? That's the dark truth. What can we learn from this? First, never trust a corporation that puts profits over people. R.J. Reynolds knew smoking killed, but they lied because telling the truth would hurt their bottom line. That's not unique to tobacco. We see it in other industries too. Pharmaceuticals hiding drug side effects, fossil fuel companies denying climate change, tech companies ignoring privacy violations. The playbook is the same. Deny, deflect, delay, and keep making money. Second, regulation matters. It took decades. But eventually the government stepped in with warning labels, advertising bans, and settlements. Those regulations saved lives. Youth smoking rates dropped after the MSA. Public smoking bans reduced secondhand smoke exposure. Without government action, the tobacco companies would have kept going unchecked. The free market didn't fix this. Laws did. Third, public awareness is powerful. Once people understood the truth about smoking, behavior started changing. Education campaigns, graphic warning labels, and media coverage helped people quit and prevented kids from starting. The truth is a weapon against corporate lies, but it only works if people have access to it. And fourth, hold corporations accountable. The lawsuits against Big Tobacco, including Camel, were crucial. And they forced internal documents into the open. They made the companies pay for some of the damage they caused. Not enough, but something. When corporations lie and people die, there have to be consequences. Real consequences. The Camel cigarette story isn't over. The brand still exists. People still smoke. And tobacco companies are still finding new markets and new ways to hook customers. The fight against Big Tobacco continues. But at least now we know the truth. We know what they did. We know the lies they told and the lives they destroyed. Thanks for watching all the way through. This is the dark truth about Camel cigarettes. If you want more exposés on businesses hiding ugly secrets, subscribe to Business Behind Fame right now, hit the bell, and like this video to help spread the word. Drop a comment. What shocked you most? Was it Joe Camel targeting kids? The decades of lies about cancer? The millions of deaths? Let me know. This is the kind of story that needs to be told, because when we forget history, it repeats itself. And somewhere out there, another company is lying to protect their profits. Another product is hurting people while executives get rich. Our job is to shine a light on it, to uncover the truth, to hold them accountable. That's what we do here at Business Behind Fame, and we're just getting started. See you in the next one. Stay aware out there.